My name's Ed Spencer. I've lived in West Old Town since about 1978, and my home would be located over that way about 3 miles. It's 1.75 miles southwest of this pile you see behind us here. And originally the Old Town paper mill kind of forced in a landfill over there, but it was nothing like what you're seeing now.
Maine had a law that there can't be a new commercial landfill. The whole purpose of that law was to create a legal way of keeping out-of-state waste out of Maine. So they came up with this idea: the state as an owner can be a market participant and say, we won't accept materials from out of state. But they never took the time, they never were interested enough in keeping it out to make that stipulation.
We have a situation of information imbalance, and all people are not empowered equally to have access to the same sorts of information. How are these imbalances working to the disadvantage of our public process?
That is a state-owned landfill, and that is supposed to be space for the state of Maine's trash. And because of a couple of loopholes in the way definitions are written, they're essentially filling that up with out-of-state waste.
So at this point, you have a private waste industry that is dependent on public subsidies to be operating. It has also become dependent on the imports of out-of-state waste, very large volumes, growing volumes of out-of-state waste.
The applicant will not accept solid waste generated from out-of-state sources in the West Old Town landfill. What it says is, we own this landfill as a state of Maine and we're not letting out-of-state waste in. What it doesn't say is there's a whole category of waste that comes from out-of-state that we don't categorize as out-of-state. Casella figured out the state can buy it, they can rent it out to Casella for 30 years, and Casella can bring in out-of-state waste if the state allows them to. See? So in essence, it's just, we're going to let it in by another name.
The classification of out-of-state waste as Maine-generated waste snuck in gradually between 1999 and the present day through rulemaking and legislation, and the numbers of lobbyists for the waste industry will usually far outnumber the number of legislators who are considering these issues in committees. Out-of-state waste can become in-state waste through a so-called recycling facility or through incineration. So a truck comes from Massachusetts to a so-called recycling facility. They pull off some metals that they can get extra money for.
If they pull one 2x4 out of 80,000 pounds of waste, the remaining 79,975 pounds is now Maine waste and able to be legally landfilled here in Maine.
Now, the incineration side of this was in part how this loophole made its way into state law, but a good number of the facilities that were accepting this construction waste byproduct for fuel are no longer in operation because the subsidies that were created in the late 70s ended up running out. Now, the so-called recycling facilities, specifically ReEnergy out of Lewiston, are still taking in as much or more construction demolition debris as before the biomass burners shut down, and they need somewhere for it to go.
Over 90% of the inputs to ReEnergy come from out of state, and 93% of what leaves ReEnergy comes right here.
ReEnergy, which is operating on a site that was formerly operated by Casella, once the biomass facilities were no longer buying the large amounts of construction demolition debris fuel chips from them, all of a sudden they started pushing to legislators that they need increasing amounts of construction demolition debris and other bulky wastes to cover the landfill at the end of each day, because they are now taking in more sludge. So at the end of the day, you have the landfill with all these exposed, smelly materials, and in order to stabilize the landfill from these wet materials, they need more of these other hard, bulky materials, so-called alternative daily cover. And their argument is if they don't use that, then they would have to use virgin soil. So they're somehow saving the environment. They're recycling by doing this. But their biggest profit is from landfilling, since they receive tipping fees for every ton of waste that is disposed in the landfill. So it's to their economic benefit to increase the amount of waste coming into those landfills. Other landfills have much smaller surface area exposed on the landfill, so it's not as much of a challenge to cover the whole area at the end of the day. As it is now, if you have 6 to 10 acres exposed every day, you have to cover those 6 to 10 acres with construction and demolition debris. So it requires an increasingly large volume of this material. And the only way that material can legally go into the state-owned landfill is as Maine-generated waste. So they depend on this loophole to continue a very profitable waste operation.
Well, you know, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. This is a commercial landfill. The state is just providing cover for a new commercial landfill.
That pile behind us, the level part on top, I estimate it's 900 feet long. Anytime it rains, like if we get a thunderstorm this afternoon that drops an inch of rain, that's going to be an inch of rain over 8 or 10 acres of exposed ground. And all that is going to perk and filter down through all the chemicals, all the poisons, all the contaminants, and end up in the bottom. And that's called leachate. Then that leachate's going to be hauled by truck out of here, down to the Old Town Mill. They put it into their treatment center designed for mill waste, not for leachate. And it's going to be make some corrections for pH possibly. And it's going to be aerated to reduce the amount of BODs present in it. And then it's basically going to be released into the Penoscot River untreated.
Most of the wastewater treatment plants where landfill leachate is being discharged are older industrial wastewater discharge sites that were only designed for certain materials, and either paper mill waste, tannery waste, or what would be expected in a general municipal wastewater sewage. Either way, though, this is waste that's, again, not being allowed for disposal in surrounding states' landfills, and Maine is getting a concentration of it. None of these were designed for landfill leachate by any means. And again, unless there is a self-reported violation, the state is not expending resources to second-guess the industry that is effectively self-monitoring and self-regulating at this point.
So now that this facility is operational again, we'd like to put out a temperature recorder just downstream of the outfall, so we can kind of keep an eye on what the change in temperature is due to the discharge that comes out of this facility.
Yuck, that's nasty.
See, so there's, what did we say there was again? I think 8 ports. 1, 2, 3,
This is
4,
worse than
5.
Lincoln.
The way the permit right now for the Nine Dragons facility, which receives the leachate from the Juniper Ridge Landfill, the way that is written, there are very few toxic pollutants that they have to monitor on a frequent basis. Once a quarter, they have to do what's called the wet testing. So they collect a sample that then get separated into like different concentrations, and they expose aquatic life. And at different concentrations, they're looking to see whether there is acute or chronic toxicity at different dilutions. Essentially, they're looking to see whether it kills them or not. But that's not telling you what's killing them per se. It's just one way of looking at all of the things that are found in that effluent. And then in addition to that, they have to take one sample per year. It's basically what's called a priority pollutant scan. So there's a whole list of chemicals that they have to test for. But you have to be looking for those specific chemicals. And you know, the big concern we have is the material that's going into the landfill is a very complex mixture that comes from all over the place. It doesn't come just from Maine, it comes from other states. And that one day that you collected that sample, is that representative of what's going on all the time? You're putting all your eggs in that basket of that one sample a year or the one sample a quarter, that you're going to get a hit on that pollutant at a high enough level that will then cause DEP to say, oh, you have reasonable potential to be exceeding the health criteria, and therefore we are going to put that into your permit in the future. So it's not a permit limit until it becomes a permit limit. And to have one test a year be the thing that's going to tell you whether or not certain toxic contaminants are found in there and what the levels are of them is you know, disturbing. I think it's inadequate.
We are part of that water. That water is a part of us. We were born and raised in a place where we respected the water. We were taught to swim here. We were taught to fish here. That was our livelihood. Now I don't even dare to stick my foot in there because I don't know what's in the water.
The Penobscot was running as clean as it had for over a century. It's the largest river system in the state of Maine, and not to mention home to the Penobscot Nation. And you know, it's just shameful, the disrespect shown by our own state government. The state has never spoken about the state's interests. And hopefully I'll live long enough to see when the state's interest is they realize this pile of supposedly safe, secure landfill is a very valuable asset for the people of Maine, and it should be reserved and preserved for the citizens of Maine. And what we're trying to do is restore a common sense definition of what Maine waste is. It's very convoluted now, and what we're going to say is any Maine waste has to be waste that was discarded for the first time within the boundaries of Maine. That's what we want.